You may dial in either with your telephone or via your computer's microphone and speakers. We'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for joining us today. Our goal, we really have a lot to cover. Our goal today is to give you a brief overview and highlights of some significant regulatory-oriented updates that occurred during 2018. There will be a question and answer session at the end. We ask that you hold your questions or distribute them via chat. During our presentation, we did receive some questions in advance that we will be going over at the end. Thank you for those who did forward those questions. We also will be providing a link to a recorded presentation of this on our FDAQRC website, YouTube. We will send a link with more information on that to follow. Again, this is not intended to be all-inclusive. There's a lot of things that happened, a lot to cover. We could probably do a webinar on each one of the updates. So today, again, we encourage you to review any of your items of interest in depth on your own. We are really just going to give highlights today to raise awareness of those new updates and provide you with an opportunity to discuss them at the end. Thank you. My name is Kara Harrison. I am a project manager here at FDAQRC. My colleagues have helped me by putting together this presentation, and we'll just go right into it. Thank you. The categories that we're going to attempt to cover today are the gamut of GXPs. Good clinical, pharmacovigilance, computer systems validation and privacy, GLP, GCLP, and unfortunately we will not have time for medical device regulation at this time, but we will have that information available. So let's start out with GXP and data. What happened this year? Well, one thing of note has been the MHRA guidance on data integrity and definitions. This was a very interesting document that came out in March of 2018. This is intended to clarify MHRA's position on data integrity and minimum expectations for achieving compliance. Again, I want to stress that in this conference, all we're really going to be able to do is to provide you with highlights. I encourage each of you, when there's an item of interest, that you go review in depth, and we will be providing links to each one of these at the end of the document. We will be providing certificates and access to the presentation on our FDAQRC YouTube. Going back to the MHRA guidance, this document is actually intended to expand upon the scope of the 2016 document. Again, this is guidance, but it does clarify MHRA's position on data integrity. Some items of note, quote, "It is expected that companies will be implementing systems that comply with current regulatory expectations." This document outlines their expectation for how that compliance will be achieved across the GXPs. Again, please keep in mind that this is just guidance. They call for a risk-based assessment on data collection activities. I'm going to focus on the GCP impact. Unfortunately, I do not have a great deal of information about the rest of the GXPs, but when it comes to GCP, specifically for clinical trials, this guidance does have an impact. They call for a risk-based assessment of all data collection activities for a clinical trial. This is also very much in alignment with ICH E6R2. They recommend collection of data in a manner that allows for the full reconstruction of activities or the history of a study, and also for the amount and degree of detail to be delineated and assessed. It also calls for a documented audit trail review of any of the document collection or data collection activities that will have a formal computer-generated audit trail. Going next into good clinical practices, some of the updates of note this year include a revision of the Common Rule, additional proposed regulations and draft guidance, and information regarding patient engagement in clinical trials. We're going to start with a quick discussion of the Department of Health and Human Services Common Rule. This is in regards to the United States HHS Common Rule for Protection of Human Subjects. The actual rule was updated in 2017, but it had a carryover to 2018. The actual interim effective date was July 19th, 2018, except for the requirement to have a single IRB review. For those of you who may not know much about the Common Rule, this is a regulation that covers 17 federal agencies who are part of the United States Health and Human Services. The Common Rule is intended to standardize expectations for human subject protection, and those agencies and any entity who receives federal funds subject to those agencies is required and is subject to the Common Rule. That includes FDA, Veterans Administration, the Indian Health Service, NIH, National Cancer Institutes, a number of different agencies in their subsequent departments. The Common Rule is very similar at times to the FDA's specific requirements and regulations for consent and human subject protections, which we see at 21 CFR Part 3, 50, 56, 312 and 314, 812, 814, and others. Some key things for this Common Rule revision were that they went into effect July 19th, except for IRBs, the single IRB review, which will be effective on January 20th, 2020. Any IRBs that transition their current studies to the new requirements will need to document that decision and what date the transition occurs. Highlights for the Common Rule are actually rather extensive. There are new and revised definitions, including those for clinical trial, human subject, intervention, private information, research, etc. There are new exemption categories for what is considered secondary research. Secondary research is that for which consent is not required. It might be research using protected health information conducted by covered entities, which ties into a little bit under HIPAA, which we will not be going into today. But this change is intended to eliminate duplication between the Common Rule and HIPAA. It also would apply to storage or maintenance of secondary research use of PHI or specimens that can be identified if broad consent is obtained. It also defines other exemption categories, including educational, behavioral interventions, and surveys. The new Common Rule eliminates some circumstances in which continuing review would be required. This will include elimination of continuing review for many minimal risk studies. It will require an IRB to determine otherwise, but continuing review of research will no longer be required if the research is eligible for expedited review, is reviewed by the IRB in accordance with limited IRB review, which is a new category, or only involves data analysis or access to follow-up clinical data. If any of the above conditions are met, the IRB still must document their rationale for eliminating that continuing review. There have been revisions to informed consent requirements. These are too numerous to go into during this webinar, so I do encourage you to look at these in depth. The revised common rule is also intended to harmonize with other agency guidance. This is for the 16 to 17 federal departments and agencies that have jurisdiction with the common rule. The most other thing in note is in regards to cooperative research studies or the use of single IRB review. The use of only one IRB for cooperative research, that's when IRBs work together, for all non-federally funded research will go into effect January 20th, 2020. That is going to have some significant impact. A new requirement for informed consent: there must be a concise summary of essential study information so that a subject can make an informed decision. There is now a requirement that the consent form must disclose any plans to conduct future research using information or specimens, and a new requirement that the informed consent form must disclose whether or not subjects will or can share in commercial profit, whether or not their clinically relevant results will be returned to them, and whether or not the research might include genomic testing or sequencing. A new option in the common rule: benign behavioral interventions may qualify for exempt review. A limited IRB review may be put in place, and more studies that fall under it may qualify for exemptions. And lastly, again, continuing IRB review may no longer be required if studies are approved as minimal risk. Moving forward then for U.S., some of the regulations and draft guidance that came out of note in 2018, just recently in November, was a proposed rule for institutional review board waiver or alteration of informed consent for minimal risk. This is from FDA. This falls into place with the revisions to the common rule. Other interesting items of note include some draft guidance. Civil money penalties related to clinicaltrials.gov. As you may be aware, clinical trials meeting certain definitions and requirements are required their sponsors to submit information to clinicaltrials.gov. That's the clinical trial registry. A new guidance has been put out to describe FDA's current mode of thinking on civil money penalties. It does authorize the FDA, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act does authorize FDA to assess civil money penalties. And if the submitters of information, responsible parties, do not follow those requirements, there is an opportunity or a discussion of the opportunity for FDA to fine or propose a penalty. Another draft guidance that came out, which is long overdue, is for pregnant women, scientific and ethical considerations for inclusion in clinical trials. The guidance is intended to advance scientific research and discusses those issues that should be considered when human subject protection regulations apply. Additional proposed guidances, more information on protocol design, master protocols, clinical trial design strategies. FDA provides recommendations on sponsors expanding the reach of their oncology clinical studies. And then also adaptive designs for clinical trials of drug and biologics. Discusses adaptive design. The last item of note that we'll really talk about for U.S. is a discussion document on patient engagement in clinical trials. This was published on November 26, 2018. It further defines what patient engagement means specifically with medical device clinical trials. It explains the value and an impact on engagement of patients in design, conduct, and communication. It's intended to describe or outline some of the barriers and challenges for patient engagement, and gives ideas and discussion regarding how sponsors can engage patients not only in conduct of clinical trials, but in the design. Of note, for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, some inspection metrics. Unfortunately, the metrics for fiscal year 2018 have not yet been published, but the most recent metrics were published in 2017. As you can see for the BIMO programs, they've been busy this year. Clinical investigator, IRBs, sponsors, monitors, CROs, and GLPs. It looks as though CDRH, Center for Drugs and Epidemiological Research, as usual, had the lion's share of the inspection activity. Of those, for clinical investigators, the large percentage were no action indicated, approximately a quarter were voluntary action, and then 1% official action, which may have included warning letters, clinical holds, intent to proceed, those type of activities. Institutional review boards, the large majority, again, it falls down to approximately the same breakdown, 3/4 NAI, 1/4 voluntary action, and then 1 to 2% official action. Of the 104 sponsor, monitor, and CRO inspections, 65, 30, and 6. Let's talk about a little bit about EMA metrics. What we were able to find through our research was that 102 GCP inspections were conducted by the EMA in EU member states in 2017. That again is the last available information. Once the 2018 information is published, we will update. The EMA findings, of those, the majority of them appeared to occur at the clinical investigator level, 57% at the clinical investigator level, 30% at the sponsor level. You can see here the breakdown of their findings. Okay. Moving along then to pharmacovigilance. Some of the interesting updates in 2018 for PV include Article 57, pharmacovigilance systems, relates to pharmacovigilance systems. The EU published a subset of data from the Article 57 PV database. This was very interesting in that it provided information on marketing authorization holders and their products. Intended to provide the public with a dedicated point of contact regarding any safety concerns and regarding the products listed in the Article 57 database. It gave transparency to the EU citizens to know what products are authorized, and to give transparency into potential risks. By publishing the names of the products, it enables the pharmaceutical industry to provide a better assessment of potential naming. In pharmacovigilance, the MHRA, from April 2017 to March 2018, conducted 22 inspections of marketing authorization holders. Of those 22 inspections, there were 4 critical, 89 major, and 69 minor findings, mostly in the areas of risk management, quality management, and ongoing safety. Computer system validation and privacy updates in 2018, starting with privacy, included the EU Directive 9546/EC on the protection of individuals with regard to the processing of personal data and free movement of data. This directive was replaced by the GDPR on May 25th, 2018. GDPR has far-reaching impact. It is binding and must be applied across the European Union, but it has impact worldwide. I think most of us in our industries, whether it's GCP, GXP, or GLP, have experienced the impact of GDPR. GDPR is worthy of a webinar all on its own. However, we unfortunately do not have time to go deeply into depth, but I will go over the highlights. GDPR has oversight and has definitions of special categories data. These categories of data may not be collected or have movement unless exceptions are met. Member states of the EU can restrict the ability of research subjects to consent to collection of special categories data. GDPR and R2 also has harmonized informed consent requirements. So what does that mean? What does that look like? The protection of the principles, it's intended to add to the accountability of controllers. It defines what a controller is, and processor of data. It strengthens the confidentiality and integrity principles, especially within Article 32. And it allows subjects or provides them an opportunity to consent to data transfer or to not consent to data transfer. It provides rights to research subjects and gives them the opportunity, the absolute right of access, rectification, erasure, or the restriction of processing. The right of access must be that data is, the subject is given the opportunity to confirm whether or not data will be shared and whether they will have access to their personal data and who has access to that personal data. There is a right to have inaccuracies corrected. They have the right to be forgotten or their personal data be erased. And they have a right to restrict the processing of that data. They have a right to receive their data in a readable format. They have a right to object to the processing of data. And they have a right not to be subject to a decision made solely on automatic processing of their data. The sponsor or controller, the entity who receives data, has responsibilities, and GDPR defines what those responsibilities are. They are required to conform to the legislation. They are required to comply with the articles of the GDPR. They must implement protection policies and conduct a data protection impact assessment. Assign and monitor roles carefully with regard to the processing of study data. Create plans for notification of personal data breaches. And appoint a data protection officer. So how does that impact the CRO or the clinical trials for GCP? What this means is that any CRO with a presence in the EU will need to comply. We'll need to follow the sponsor controller guidance. We'll need to keep in mind joint accountability and follow that sponsor responsibility or controller responsibility as per their delegation from the sponsor. When we look quickly at GDPR and its comparison to U.S. privacy laws, there is a little bit of difference between what is defined as a data breach. In the U.S., unauthorized access or acquisition of a limited set of sensitive personal data elements. In GDPR, it's general, a breach of security, leading to accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, or access to personal data. There are differences in between the two, GDPR and U.S. privacy law, when it comes to risk of harm. The U.S. law does not specify what a risk of harm is or if they need to be reported. GDPR does. Safe harbor, the differences are for GDPR. If encryption mechanisms were in place, reporting is not required. In the U.S., non-reporting is limited to data that was encrypted in storage in transit. For GDPR, there's 72 hours reporting. In the U.S., it's expeditiously, with some states requiring between 5 and 30 days. So you see there's a significant difference there. For the receipt of notifications, GDPR calls out the company must notify a designated data protection authority and the individual. In the U.S., notifications are made to individuals, but some states require Attorney General or agency notification. For the actual content of notifications, GDPR has specific requirements for the content of those notifications. The U.S., not all states do. GDPR does not disclose publicly breaches, but the data protection impact assessments are available. In the U.S., several states, attorney generals, and HHS maintains a website listing of any reported data breaches. For processor notifications, undue delay. The GDPR requires third-party processors to report data breaches without undue delay. In the U.S., the responsibility is per client contract. There is no universal requirement for notification. So let's switch gears. We're halfway through. Computer system validation updates. Of note this past year, the WHO guidelines for validation were published in August of 2018. This encompasses a GAMP approach to GXP computerized systems in ST, FDA, and FDA 21 CFR Part 11, among others. It applies specifically to GMP, but the tenets of it can be extended to all systems in practice. So there could be impact. Again, these are guidance. These are not regulations, but they are considered best practices. The WHO calls for computerized systems to be validated throughout their life cycle according to risk management. The purpose of the guidelines is to confirm specifications, and that validation confirms specifications conform to user requirements, and that there be objective evidence to support that. The scope of the guidelines is software, hardware, infrastructure, equipment, and operating systems. And the validation activities should address functionality, configuration, and customization. WHO calls for validation documentation and a company and entity's validation, that there'd be documentation to support the purpose and scope, the roles and responsibilities, the approach of validation, what the objectives and strategies are, that there be risk management, clear requirements and specifications, and documentation to prove that those specifications were met during testing and use. Acceptance criteria to determine whether or not the needs are being met, the testing is appropriate, are predetermined and listed in the validation protocol, and that the selection and assessment of vendors is based on risk-based methodology and is reviewed for each new contract. They're requiring or recommend that any supporting documentation verifies configuration management and change control, that it be risk-based, and that audit trails are in place. That procedures are in place for backup and recovery of both the application itself and any data that it manages. That there are procedures in place and that they are effective for error handling and corrective action. That there be business continuity and disaster recovery planning. That there is a risk-based assessment and procedure in place for documentation, for maintenance and support of the system. That there is a procedure and a process in place for review of audit trails and metadata as necessary for data security. And that the deliverables that are produced through validation and documentation are risk-based, including a periodic review and a revalidation if necessary, or an assessment of potential revalidation needs. Moving forward then to significant GLP updates. Just a quick overview, GLP is for non-clinical laboratory studies that support applications for FDA or regulated products. They're the minimum basic requirements for study conduct. We're talking about FDA, but they have application elsewhere. Well, honestly, no major changes were published in 2018 related to the GLPs, but there were some updated documents and guidance. For FDA, there was a significant guidance update in May 2018 for bioanalytical method validation. This document outlines the principles of bioanalytical method validation, the parameters of bioanalysis, how to validate the methods or the principles for validation of those methods, the principles for sample reanalysis, the documentation required in a validation effort, recommendations and acceptance criteria for a validation effort, and common issues that may arise. It was designed to ensure that key questions are answered during a validation of methods. Things including, does the method actually measure the intended analyte? Does anything interfere with the measurement, or is the method specific and selective for the intended target? It discusses variability and to keep those in mind during a validation, the accuracy and precision. What is the range that provides reliable data? What is the sensitivity of the method, upper and lower limits of quantification? How does the actual process of sample collection and storage and handling, how that might affect the reliability of data that are collected through the method? What steps need to be followed when collecting samples, or do samples need to be frozen? These are all elements that this guidance discusses and that must be taken into consideration during bioanalytical method validation. Some metrics in regards to FDA for GLP inspections, 25 to 35, it doesn't appear that there were any significant official action indicated classifications during the time period of fiscal year 2017. In our review for updates, we did notice also that the Swiss authorities gave an update to their GLP compliance monitoring program. This outlines some steps to be considered of a test facility withdrawing from the program. They also updated their interpretation of the GLP principles. OECD published an advisory document in 2018, advisory document number 19, on the management, characterization, and use of test items. This was very interesting in that it provided clarity regarding the expectation of GLP compliance monitoring authorities on how test items are managed throughout the sampling life cycle. It overviews expectation for characterization and calls for a risk-based approach. All right, for our last few topics, GCLP updates. Again, just a quick refresher, GCLP is a mix of GLP and GCP. There is no one single regulation that mandates or uses or describes GCLP, but most of us rely on the WHO guidelines, the World Health Organization guidelines for GCLP guidance and principles. Again, not a lot of updates in 2018, but some interesting dialogue, some blogs actually were published by MHRA regarding GCP training in the GCLP world. I've included a link here for that. Basically what this blog and guidance indicates is that it's expected that people conducting GCLP have appropriate knowledge, experience, and training, depending upon the role that they fulfill, that they are aware of their roles and responsibilities, that training provided will be appropriate and proportionate to their role, and it will be updated as necessary, and that training and experience is documented and periodically updated and reviewed by both members of staff and management. All right. That leads us to the references that we've included for some of this interesting reading and these updates. We're going to move then to questions.
Thank you, Kara. Before we get started with some of the questions from our audience, we did have some that were sent in that I would like to address first. One of the questions that was sent in were how to prepare for regulatory inspections based on the new regulations.
Wow, that's a pretty broad topic. Not sure we can cover that here, but the best advice for any update that I can give you is to identify what your potential target for inspection would be, research and obtain the most current regulatory information, the compliance programs, any of the guidance documents for perhaps the MHRA and the EMA, any of the working group guidance on how to conduct inspections. Review that thoroughly and assess your operations accordingly. And then, as always, whenever there is a new regulation or a new guidance, you assess your operations to see where it pertains and conduct your business that way going forward.
Okay. Another question we had was changes in inspections relative to the BIMO realignment. Explain the impact to scheduling findings. Are the FDA investigators finding more since BIMO is their specialty, and changes in inspection scope of FDA relative to ICH R2 if there are any?
Again, I think that's a little outside the scope of this webinar. Be happy to discuss that offline with the requester because that sounds like another webinar altogether.
Okay. Another question we had was, there was one of our webinar participants is hearing that the CGMP data integrity will apply across GXP. Do you think that's true?
It has applicability, yes. Again, this is a guidance. The data integrity guidance, we did talk a little bit about that at the beginning of the webinar. It can have applicability, but it's not a firm regulation. So it's a best practice that you can assess according to your organization's operations to see where it best fits and the best practices and implement that.
Great. Another question we had a lot of good questions sent in pre-webinar, so we're trying to address those first. Someone asked for the summary of changes in the FDA bioanalytical method validation guidance, and once again, I would say that's a seminar among itself.
Right. We did try to provide the most significant highlights. I recommend that you go to each one of these items of note and review them in depth. Unfortunately, for the purposes of today, what our intention was really just to raise awareness to some of the significant updates. We unfortunately did not have time to go into specifics. If you would like us to perhaps plan on a new webinar with specific topics, happy to do so.
Great. What's another question we had, what is your experience with GCP certification, and do you find if it helps promote your business relationship?
Wow, okay. I'm going to assume that's GCP certification as an individual.
Yes. That would be my assumption as well.
I hope that I'm answering that in the right direction. That's an individual choice, of course, but as professionals, anything that we can do to expand our qualifications, add to our credentials, I think is a positive. Anytime that you can show that you have met minimum expectations and you have that opportunity to do so, I recommend it. It shows your commitment to your profession and also your expertise.
Is there a guidance document or regulatory reference specific to the archival of Center for Veterinary Biologic Material Types?
That I do not know. That is outside of my area of expertise.
Are we going to provide the slide deck to participants?
Yes. We are also going to be providing a link to this presentation on our FDAQRC YouTube, which we will send information afterwards.
Earlier in your presentation, Kara, you addressed intent to proceed. Can you explain that any further?
Yes. Intent to proceed is it's a notification letter that goes out to clinical investigators for the purposes of disqualification. That usually only happens after a good deal of inspectional effort.
Okay, great. Just for GDPR requirements, one slide stated that it applies for CROs with a presence in the EU. It is not just limited to having a presence in the EU. It also covers CROs who may have EU citizens that may have relocated to the U.S. who participate in the clinical trial. Is that correct?
I believe so. GDPR is actually not just, I want to clarify, it doesn't impact just CROs. It impacts entities who manage data. Its main focus is EU citizens, but it has a global impact based upon what activities are being performed. The CROs may actually be located in the United States, but data is located in the EU, or EU citizens may be involved who have data. So it really no longer, I'm not an expert on GDPR at all, again, but my understanding is that it has a global impact regardless of where you are. If the data in some way, shape, or form is collected, processed, stored, or somewhere, either within the EU or in regards to an EU citizen.
And then I'm going to go back to a couple of questions that we had pre-seminar. The current 1572 is expired. When does the FDA usually make available an updated version, and what is the rationale for the expiration date on this form?
There's actually some guidance out there regarding this. The the OMB expiration date really does not mean that the form has expired. All that means is that the next review to determine whether or not an update is necessary. The form that is published does not have an expiration date. So if it says the OMB expiration date is passed, you can still use that form until a new one is submitted and published.
And I believe there may be some further guidance on the FDA website in regard to this as well.
Right.
So, do we need to validate Excel spreadsheets that are used for tracking internal quality activities within a CRO that are not updated in the CTMS or the trial master file or of the sponsor?
Okay. That's a little outside the scope of this. However, it really depends upon how it's being used.
Right. It's probably just good business sense to get those updated.
Okay.
Are there any other questions from our audience?
I did want to point out, someone had just pinged clarification here regarding GLP and bioanalytical methods. Yes, GLP and bioanalytical methods are different. GLP is non-human studies analyzed. Sample analysis for non-human studies. Bioanalytical is different and is GCLP. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I do not have any questions from our audience. Does anyone else have anything?
Okay. Well, again, I do appreciate the participation. Again, today was not intended to be all-inclusive of all the updates or to be specific legal advice or regulatory advice. There was a lot to cover. Our intention was mainly to make you aware of those significant updates during the year. Again, details or additional information regarding these updates are available, and I encourage you to research and review any of items of interest that you have. If you would like to explore the possibility of additional webinars with subject matter experts, of which I am not a subject matter expert in all of these items, let's discuss. We can perhaps put together future webinars. If you have additional questions that you would like to reach out, please feel free to contact me at my email. You can also request a certificate. We will be providing certificates by, I believe, Janet, next week?
Yes.
If you request. And we will also be posting this session and slides on our FDAQRC YouTube. Thank you for your participation. We have kept this to the 1 hour. If again, I do apologize if there was any confusion with the sound or with the technical aspects of the webinar. We did have a lot to cover. We do appreciate it, and send us ideas for future webinars. Have a great day.